matter was addressed and settled that it had in it the requirement for going to the polls, and that was surrounding the whole question of the committee's report had recommended or would recommend the change in the structure of the assembly, whatever that change might be, but one of the changes we expected, because that came down with acceptance by the majority of a 15-seat house that would require us going back to the polls in Tobago and contest a 16-seat house. Well, the committee did in fact report, and the 6-month period since January, that election till now, has not resulted in any settlement where a presiding officer could have been elected, and in fact the Tobago House of Assembly has been being managed and is represented by the incumbent outgoing members as required by law. Because notwithstanding what you will hear and accusations made, the law specifically spells out that until a presiding officer is selected, the assembly, those who are, until a chief secretary is elected, the outgoing officers hold, just to make sure that there's continuity in what in effect is a period of transition. This has gone on now for some months, and I'm sure there are not very many people who would like this to continue much longer. The committee reported, the parliament debated, and with respect to the number of seats or the makeup of the assembly, one of the recommendations of the Joint Select Committee of the Parliament is that the assembly should now be drastically adjusted to have a body made up of elected and unelected persons. I think it's 15 elected persons and 8 chosen, 5 by the majority, whoever that is, 2 by the minority, and 2 by the president in that office's own discretion. So those recommendations came in response to the consultation and advice and the vision of a new assembly. However, that remains in abeyance now, because the committee's report, after 2 days of debate in the parliament, the committee's report is now in committee of the whole house. And I don't know when that would end. I don't know how it will end. What I do know is that the government that I lead does not have the votes to bring about the change to effect what the committee has recommended there. We have seen in Tobago support for and voices against. There are those in Tobago who, particularly those people who I lead in the PNM, and those who are not led by anybody in a political party, the independent voices in Tobago, have their view. The political opposition in Tobago has been, to use their word, reject what the committee has offered. But I took steps in the parliament to keep the committee's work alive for a while, because the parliament went on recess after that debate, and that committee work will remain there until it dies when the parliament prorogues. So that brings us to what happens to Tobago and its deadlock. And we therefore have to go back to where we were in January. And I've written something here for the benefit of you members of the media who do your yeoman service. First, in understanding exactly what is being said and what the law says and what is going to be done, because we don't want too many misunderstandings, or any for that matter. So let me just read the law as it stands for you. I'll read it fairly slowly, and I think we'll be in a position to give an electronic copy to all of you after, so you can have it for your own consultation. So free your mind a little bit and listen carefully to what I'm reading, but you will get your own electronic copy before you leave. Right. The Tobago House of Assembly Amendment Act was passed in Parliament as Act number 2 of 2021 and assented to by the President on March 16th, 2021. I must point out that that assent would have been at the request of the Cabinet. The Act amends 2 existing laws. 1, the Tobago House of Assembly Act, Chapter 2503, and 2, the Election and Boundaries, Local Government and Tobago House of Assembly Act, Chapter 2505. Cabinet today, Thursday, July 22nd, 2021, approved the proclamation of the Tobago House of Assembly Amendment Act by Her Excellency the President on Monday, July 26, 2021. So, after asking for an assent, which has been had, the Cabinet today asked for a proclamation. And the proclamation date is to be next Monday, which is the 26th of July. After proclamation of the Tobago House of Assembly Amendment Act by the President, the following is the process that will occur. 1. Under Section 4.2c.2 of the Elections and Boundaries, Local Government and Tobago House of Assembly Act, Chapter 2505, the Election and Boundaries Commission is required within 90 days of the proclamation of the Tobago House of Assembly Amendment Act to produce a report and submit such report to the Minister of Rural Development and Local Government for the purpose of creating 15 electoral districts. 2. The Minister with responsibility for local government and rural development is then required by law to lay before the House of Representatives for its approval the draft of an order by the President for giving effect, whether with or without modification, to the recommendations contained in the report. That's the report that the EBC will produce. And that draft may make provision for any matters which appear to the Minister to be incidental to or consequential upon the other provisions of the draft. 3. Where any draft order made under this section gives effect to any such recommendations with modifications, the Minister of Rural Development and Local Government shall lay the draft order before the House together with a statement of the reasons for the modification. The statement, item 4, statement and draft order by the President for giving effect to the recommendations in the report is then debated in the House of Representatives. 5. Where any draft order is approved by resolution of the House of Representatives, the Minister shall submit the draft order to the President, who shall make the order in terms of the draft. 6. The order comes into force on such day as may be prescribed in it and has the force of law. 7. Upon the order coming into law, there will now be 15 seats in the electoral area of Tobago. 8. Section 22(3) of the Tobago House of Assembly Act, which was amended by the Tobago House of Assembly Amendment Act, then kicks in, and the primary election can then be called, and a date fixed for the election by the Chief Secretary upon consultation with the President and the Prime Minister. 9. Pursuant to the amended Tobago House of Assembly Act, the date for the primary election cannot be earlier than 2 months from the making of the order, nor can it be later than 3 months after the making of the order. And 10. Once the date for the primary election is fixed, the EBC then commences all its processes under the Election and Boundaries Act for the holding of such election. Now, having thoroughly confused you with that, let me crystallize it for John Public. One, proclamation of the Act is Monday, 26 July 2021. So there will be there has been a request for a proclamation. So come Monday, that amendment will become law. The EBC begins producing a report for the creation of 15 seats in Tobago for submission to the relevant minister, in this case, the Minister for Local Government. The report of the EBC must be completed within 90 days of the proclamation. It doesn't mean it will be 90 days, but it must be concluded within a 90-day period. But it is the EBC that will decide how much time it needs to produce that report. Whether it is 1 month, 1 week, 2 months, that is entirely up to the independent body, the EBC. But they have a limit of 90 days. It must be done within 90 days. However, we must bear in mind that the EBC has just done work on Tobago in January for an election and should be well positioned and very familiar with the up-to-date situation of the electorate in Tobago, and therefore we expect that this would be done well within the 90-day period. And then the draft order and statement of reasons to give effect of recommendations in the report tabled by the minister and debated in the House. So once the report is done by the EBC, at the pleasure of the EBC, and they submit that report to the relevant minister, takes it to the Parliament, and there's to be a debate on it in Parliament. That debate will end with a resolution in the House to complete it. The report of the EBC usually is accepted without mores, but it can be amended by the House, and they could add another seat, they could add 2, they could take it. The House has the power to do that. But whatever the Parliament agrees to is what will be the final position of the EBC's report into the Parliament. And that order that will then see the end of the debate in the Parliament. The Parliament will then have confirmed and make that law, and that order for 15 seats will be made by the President, and that will be gazetted. As the THA is not fully constituted, with no election of a presiding officer and others being so circumstanced, after the passage of 14 days from the last primary election, the THA, by virtue of the proclaimed act, which is what's going to happen on Monday and confirmed by the Parliament later on, which amends the existing laws, that act will stand, the House will stand dissolved, and a fresh election for the THA with 15 seats will follow. So the dissolving of the Parliament, the THA, will come into force when that proclamation and the order being accepted, right? Let me read it over again. Because the THA is not constituted now with a newly elected Chief Secretary, nor a presiding officer, it would be the Chief Secretary who normally would initiate the process of dissolving the House. But since there is no new Chief Secretary subsequent to the last election, the dissolving of the House is now to be done by the provisions of the law that's going to be passed in the Parliament. Because provision is made in that amendment to dissolve the House. Because as we sit here now, the THA could not have been dissolved to go back to the polls, because there was this contention as to who calls the THA and who can dissolve it. The existing law spells out that it is the Chief Secretary who can do that. But the Chief Secretary is not in a position so to do now, because they have not been able to elect a chamber, right? But so what we did when we amended the law, we made provision for the amendment to give power to dissolve the House, right? So it reads, as the THA is not fully constituted, with no election of a presiding officer and Chief Secretary and so on, and being so circumstanced after the passage of 14 days, because that's what the law says, right? If after 14 days you have not been able to do that process, then the House will stand dissolved, and then a primary election will become due. So it's on that basis that the House is now dissolved, and a primary election becomes due, because 14 days have long passed. So the House can now be dissolved once that new arrangement is made into law. And then the date of the primary election is fixed by the Chief Secretary upon consultation with the President and the Prime Minister. That's the normal procedure. And then you can't have the election inside of 60 days. Right? But you can't wait longer than 90 days. So the election date, when it is called, will not be less than 60 days and will not be more. So it means that it will fall in a window between 60 and 90 days. So that will then allow the people of Tobago to deal with the issue that arose in January as a result of the election outcome, and that will settle a number of things there. So that deals with that. The other thing I want to touch on is our vaccination program here in Tobago and nationally, of course. As of today, we have vaccinated 11,683 people who've got their first dose in Tobago, and 9,189 people have got their second dose. Tobago requests 10,000 units from the last shipment, and they will, because Tobago's population is small, whatever is requested here, they will get. So, in short, Tobago is adequately supplied and will be adequately supplied with enough vaccine to meet the needs of every person in Tobago who needs to be vaccinated. And they are well on the way to that, but we'd like to see that continue and be accelerated, of course. At the national level, we've come a long way from where we were. At one time, a few months ago, the issue was no vaccine in hand and the supply route not visible, and we had very few vaccines. But we always knew from the scientific information that what is needed by the population of Trinidad and Tobago is to get vaccinated because the vaccines would provide a benefit. The benefit being it reduces the transmission of the virus among people. It allows people who are infected to respond better and not get sick and require hospitalization, and it virtually eliminates persons getting killed by being infected. It does not mean that you cannot be infected. You're immunized, but the immunity that is given is not one that prevents you from being infected, but it allows you to survive an infection. And that data is becoming stronger and stronger every day as we look at populations around the world where vaccinated people are avoiding hospitalization and death. And the virus, which is now returning and raging in the developed countries in particular, even where they are heavily vaccinated, overall, the people who are not vaccinated tend to be the ones who are, in fact, being severely affected, as it was in the beginning when the virus came to us. We have now had our hands on, actually hands on, 1.2 million doses of vaccine. And since those vaccines that we've had to date are double dose vaccines, you need 2 doses to conclude your vaccination. We have in hand, or have had in our possession, approximately 1.2 million doses could vaccinate 600,000 people. You might have heard me say early on that our target was to get vaccines for 900,000 people. So even though we have vaccines, or had hands on vaccines for 600,000 people, we still have to continue looking for more because the target requires us to aim for another 300,000 people. But in the meantime, the process that we have been using is one of voluntary response and encouraging people to come in a managed way to the sites for vaccination. And that was largely because we didn't have enough vaccines. So we had to manage the supply that we had in such a way that you didn't have a rush to a point and didn't have vaccines to supply them, and the rush itself would become a problem. As of today, notwithstanding what we have used, first dose and second dose, and that those two categories will account for almost 500,000 doses. The figure I have this morning before today's work is 477,000 shots have been used, both first dose and second dose. And it means then that of the 1.2 million that we had in hand, we still have approximately 700,000 doses and can therefore vaccinate 350,000 people. I must tell you that we need to step up and have more people vaccinated as quickly as possible. The biggest part of the assignment has been done, which is to get vaccines. We've got vaccines in hand now, and now today, going forward into next week and the week after, we have 700,000 doses. We need to get them into arms. And that is why I'm concerned that we are beginning to get to the point where we could easily get to a point where there are more vaccines in hand than there are people to be vaccinated. If we get to that point, then we are going to be asking for big trouble, because we are seeing where the unvaccinated is the population that is most at risk, where the risk is one of serious hospitalization and death, requiring before significant intensive care unit work at the hospitals, high dependency unit work at the hospitals. And therefore, given what we are thinking in the early part of this year, that we need to get vaccinated, that we need to get vaccines, we need to convert that thought to action. We have vaccines and we need to be vaccinated. Add to that is that the threat that we faced last year is a different threat this year. So far, thankfully, we have not been able to confirm within our population the Delta virus, Delta variant. But it would be unreasonable to expect that as the world is being ravaged by it, and we are part of the mixing world, that we will be able to sterilize ourselves and insulate ourselves from it. It is quite possible that that virus could end up among our population, because the population of Trinidad and Tobago is mixing with the population of the United States in particular and other areas. We'll be fooling ourselves to believe that we will go through the rest of the pandemic without any chance of the Delta virus getting among us. So we have to cater for that situation. And the best way to cater for it, if it comes our way, is to meet a vaccinated population. Because out there where it exists, it is being confirmed by the scientific data that the vaccinated population is standing a very good chance, regardless of what vaccine you have been vaccinated with. But once you have been vaccinated and you build up some immunity, you are in a better position to respond to the Delta virus. Of course, this being science, there are very few scientific positions that are not challenged and that there isn't a contrary view. You will see from time to time researchers or universities or whatever giving positions that may question that. We're always open to the questions, and we are learning as we go, because this virus is brand new and it will be teaching us along the way. But by and large, the governments of the world are reporting that their vaccinated populations are doing much better than their unvaccinated populations. And I don't think one needs a bigger invitation than that. So we will encourage Tobago that has the opportunity for every person in Tobago who needs to be vaccinated and do so as quickly as possible, because you don't know when you will be exposed to the virus. It's not going to be postponed until your next party, the next friend you meet, the next air you breathe. Do it as quickly as possible, and the life you save may be your own I can tell you, personally, I have experienced the loss of persons in this pandemic, whether they're neighbors, friends. I've had members of my family in wards on intensive care, not knowing whether they'll come out. Thankfully, they have made it through, but the experience is not one that they would want to share with others. So please, the government has done its part, the most difficult part, and we're asking you to do your part. Get vaccinated. Well, those are the 2 points I wanted to raise with you today. So if you have any questions, I'll take them now. Yes, Liz.
Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister. Welcome to Tobago.
Thank you very much for welcoming me home.
Yes. In terms of the questions, one of my first questions is, are you disappointed that it had to come to this in terms of the Parliament and the government intervening in the deadlock? That's one. Two, persons are asking how soon will churches reopen and also beaches in terms of limited time. I don't know if the government is looking at like 8 to 4 or 6 to 5 p.m. and have the police look at it. And also another question, I'm just jabbing in one time, is...
Well, let's take two first. Eh? Okay. You'll get the opportunity to ask all. Because you know when I come here, I don't leave unanswered questions, right? So if you ask too many, I probably forget the most important ones you ask first. Disappointed. Yes, I'm a little bit disappointed because it could have easily been different. It would have been much more exciting if we were able to have the matter solved without this, you know. But the provision is there for it. The law was amended and nobody is disadvantaged, and we'll get it fixed. If the question you're asking me is whether I'm disappointed that the Joint Select Committee was not able to conclude its work, I will say yes, but I'm not surprised because these are the political ways of the political life. So I'm not surprised that the matter is still in committee, and I myself would look forward to see where it goes from there. I can't predict where it will go, but it's in the place where it belongs. The one thing that I am satisfied with is that for the first time, a coherent and identifiable pathway and structure for a new Tobago administration is visible. And of course, some people accept it as progress, and a minority believe that it is not nirvana, and therefore it should be rejected. We believe that with all the work that's been done and all the time spent and all the points of views considered, that what is before the people of Tobago is in fact a giant step involving amendment to the Constitution and opportunities for Tobago to manage its affairs in a dramatically different way and to take responsibility for this island. But it may take some time for the people of Tobago to appreciate that and to accept it, and then it doesn't end there. It will require others in the nation to agree to those significant changes. So we've made some progress, but not enough to prevent us from having to use the amendment that I just outlined there. The next question was...
you about if the churches will reopen.
Oh, yeah. I couldn't answer that today, but I can tell you what the expectation is. But let me tell you first what is guiding our decision-making. We cast your mind back to April, May, and June, that quarter. We were in great difficulty. We started getting into difficulty in March. The numbers started going up in March. By April, we were at uncomfortably numbers by end of April. And by May and June, we were losing people at an alarming rate, and our hospitals were virtually full. We were just on the brink of not being able to take people into the hospital, and that's what you see on the news, because it's one of the things you see in a population where the infection is so high. You see it overcoming the ability of the population's infrastructure to provide health care to those who need it. And I've always said from day one that the one thing that the state will do, everything that's reasonable to do, is to provide health care to those persons who need it. So far, we have not found ourselves in a situation where we couldn't provide that care, but we came very close to having that situation develop. And we took steps to roll that back. The rolling back is taking place to a certain extent. We're still not back to where we were in March, but we are sufficiently comfortable with the level of risk that we are taking by bringing out large groups of people. We brought out the construction sector. That was about 45,000 people. Last time we met, we brought out the food services sector and some other smaller ones. There are still one or two sectors that are not fully operational. In the public transport, we are at 3/4, thereabouts. I think it's 3/4 we are at, yeah. But we have some restriction there. We have serious restrictions on outdoor sporting activity, but we did allow groups of 4 to come out. I can tell you I had my first game of golf in 3.5 months, and I won. Anyway, we're doing it very cautiously, but substantially. We did roll back the restrictions substantially. And now we are keeping our eyes fixed on the school year in September, hoping to manage our affairs both in the vaccination program and the other restrictions that are personal, that we will be in a position, because if we are in a position like this in September, we will open our schools, even with the children not being vaccinated. But if we are lucky and we get the right kind of vaccine, there's one vaccine that is approved by the WHO for use on children under 12 and above. If we are lucky and we get that vaccine, we will take steps to vaccinate as many of our children as possible. But that target of mid-September being such that we could think about bringing children out to school is the target that we are working towards. Now, you mentioned beaches. Hopefully, if our numbers remain manageable and the risk remain reasonable, then we could be in a position to begin to go on the beach and not be at an exceptionally increased risk. On the opposite side of it, if things revert to what it was in May or June, we certainly can't allow that to just continue unabated. So it's all going to depend on how we go steady as we go. And this government is particularly careful of learning from the mistakes of others. There are many instances that you can see around the world where there were restrictions and lockdowns and so on, and people get tired and you get all kinds of advice and encouragement. But where you did, in fact, open up too fast, it results in a loss of the progress that you have made, and you can easily find that the risk has been too great because your infection levels return, and you have to then go back and try to restrict it in the same unwanted actions. So rather than risk that, we do it a bit more cautiously, knowing that it is not pleasing everybody, but it will please none of us if we do it too quickly to please everybody, and we end up in a matter of a week or two getting numbers at the hospitals and in the daily reports which tell us that we can't allow this to continue, we have to go back into some restrictions. So when we come out of the restrictions, we want to be able to continue without having demands for restrictions again. We want to be able to, even if we are doing it with some restrictions in place, as we have been doing with the bars, the people who make their living, they have been carrying a lot of this for the longest while, because we have taken the position that drinking and socializing by a bar is something that we'll sacrifice so that the other activities that are more beneficial will take place. But everybody can make a case for their own activity. But if we do that, and everybody has his or her own activity, then we don't get the restrictions that we need. And in the absence of the required restrictions, we could end up in a situation where our numbers become alarming and call for whole-scale and deeper restrictions. So I know you'd like to be on the beach in August. So would I, but I wouldn't go there if it is excessively dangerous to the population. And if we do, especially here in Tobago, if we are able to be in a position to open beaches or have access, even restricted access to the beaches in August, that would be some progress. But we're not going to do it just for the sake of adding it to the list. We'll do it while as we measure the risk levels that would be exposed. And you see, Tobago, because of Tobago's geographical nature, being separate from the rest of the population, you have the opportunity here to fight the virus a little differently, because it's a smaller population, and you can take advantage of that, and we'd like to see you take advantage of that. And once Tobago is like that, we'd like to keep it in a way that things can happen in Tobago, which maybe might not be able to be happening elsewhere. But of course, your activities in Tobago are largely either dependent on or involving the people of Trinidad. So there isn't much of a line that we can draw between us. Right now we have restrictions on the air bridge. We maintain some restriction there, but we've increased, about 2 weeks ago or so, we've increased the amount of people coming on the sea bridge. We haven't seen any negative response to that yet, so we're keeping our fingers crossed there. But the whole thing is at the personal level. Today I saw with horror the front page of a newspaper where a family of three generations of people passed in the COVID-19 in our country. This is the kind of thing that happens frequently in 1918, the Spanish flu. You know, we warned about it earlier on, we talked about it, but it happening to us and seeing it is a different story. That is very distressing, and I extend my deepest sympathy to all the people around that family and that community, because, you know, I have a clear understanding of how painful that is. Yes, George.
Yeah. Prime Minister George Leacock, Radio Tambrin. I just want to go back to the THA thing. From what date would the House be dissolved? Would it be from the declaration on the 26th, or would it be from when the report of the EBC comes to the House?
The report of the EBC is only a recommendation to the House.
Yeah.
It is when the House accepts it, in whatever form it accepts it. When the House
accepts it,
passes the order. What comes
and then 14 days from that.
Yeah, what comes to the Parliament is the report with a draft order, and the Parliament will debate that draft order. And if the Parliament accepts the draft order, upon the Parliament's acceptance, it goes to the President to be perfected as an order. And that's when the counting begins.
All right, I want to switch to the COVID response, and I fully understand that the response is the responsibility of the Tobago House of Assembly.
Sorry, I'm not hearing.
The COVID response.
Yeah.
I want to switch to that. And I fully understand it's the responsibility in Tobago of the Tobago House of Assembly. But in a sense, you opened that door for me a little bit, as the lawyers would say, when you did in fact report on what has happened, what has been happening in Tobago. However, unfortunately, we reported today at a 10 o'clock meeting presented by the Division of Health, 52 cases in Tobago. And they have been continually explained by the Division of Health as a cluster within the hospital, and it's not an outbreak, and all the semantic things that we're used to. I'm pushing as far as I can, and pushing you as far as I'm able to push you to get you to respond, because it will spill over to Trinidad the same way it's spilling over to Tobago if things get out of hand here a little bit.
Yeah, well, you've gone as far as I would want to go on this. If you notice, I did not mention the day-to-day operations or today's numbers, either for Trinidad or Tobago. I expect you'll get that from the normal thing. What I did before I came in here was to ask how Tobago has done so far. And that's why I was able to mention how many doses first, how many doses second. And I also was able to tell you, because I watch out for Tobago at the cabinet, that what Tobago gets, they need 10,000 shots, and they will get it, and they've been getting it. So the numbers I quoted have nothing to do with what you're raising there about the outbreak and how many people today and so on. Those interpretations, I too, like you, I rely on the medical experts. I've seen your Tobago doctor saying what it is, and I go along with that. I am not inclined, maybe it's because of my scientific training, I'm not inclined to disregard scientific interpretations and scientific training for speculation. That might be a fault, but
It might be comparators, but I want to switch completely to a different thing, and that is our hesitancy when anybody talks about vaccinations being mandatory. I myself, as a student several years ago in another country, it was mandatory that I have a tuberculosis shot. I have, and most people have traveled to countries where yellow fever is mandatory. If you don't have it, they turn you back at the airport. Why is there sort of almost knee-jerk, immediate hesitancy? Nobody wants to say at any level that for anybody, even persons, for example, who are frontline workers, who are at risk themselves and at risk of putting other vulnerable people at risk, because nobody goes to the hospital if they're well. So they're sick. They're saying that somebody has a comorbidity. They wouldn't be in the hospital unless something was wrong with them. And then if they go to the hospital, and at that point, they are infected by somebody who is a frontline worker and refuses to be vaccinated, I don't know that the rights of any individual supersedes the rights to not be vaccinated, supersedes the right of somebody else to try to stay alive.
Well, I think, George, if you repeat that on radio time, it might help some people. The problem is that sometimes you have to encourage people to do the right thing. The right thing is not obvious as the next action of a reasonable person in some instances. Right now, we are at the stage of encouraging people. I respect the right of people to say that, leave me in control of my body. Let me make my decision as to what I do with it. I respect that right. But then, as you have said, there comes a point along the way where that right will intersect with other rights. I mean, you know, I saw a column this week by a writer who spoke about the ownership of a gun and the use of a firearm. We have restrictions in this country about who should get a firearm. You have to get a license. You may have all the money to buy one, but the population says no, because you can't get a license. And also, if you do get a license, then the population is concerned as to how you use it. So there comes a point along the way where the wider national interests will have to prevail, as it has been prevailing all along. Many, many parents who have had children would know that the vaccination program for the nation's children is not voluntary in most cases. To enter school, the law says you must put children in school. That's where it starts, at the Truancy Act. If you have a child, you have a responsibility to get the child educated. Right? If the child is not being properly educated at home, right, then you have to put the child in school, otherwise you and the truant officer will have a conversation. And then the law says that you must vaccinate this child for certain possible infections to come into the school. And we've been living with that all the time. But what we have not been living with is Facebook and other kinds of things, where everybody now has the right to be an expert on a matter of life and death. You would be alarmed at the reasons that people give for not wanting to be vaccinated. It's not just simply taste. Anything you could think of is a reason. And recently I was talking to a friend who was not vaccinated, and the reason was that I was afraid of the needle. And I had to suggest that maybe you should go down to Cuba and let them allow you to look into the ward and see what your choice would be. A second where I was vaccinated, and I must tell you, I did not even notice. The needle is so thin, I did not even notice it going into my arm. Before I knew what had happened, she was putting the cotton on the spot. So it's not a painful process. But to see what goes on in the ward, where you're hooked up to 6 or 8 tubes in a life and death situation. And if there are a lot of people like that, remember, the doctors and the nurses we've seen on television hospitals where people were actually hooked up, but there was no technical staff to take advantage of the equipment that was hooked onto you. So we don't want to go to that position. So we keep encouraging people to consider that your best position is to be among the vaccinated. If that does not work sufficiently, and we are sufficiently endangered to a reaction that is hugely disadvantageous to the wider population, then as I said before, at that time, in that stage, any government will have to act. Some governments are already acting on it, right? Because you cannot have a right which intersects with other people's rights and only claim your right. You also have a right to protect other people, because you could say, I will take the risk with COVID all along. But what about the risk of you infecting other people? That's where the rights intersect.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. I can have the holder, Channel 5 News, Tobago Channel 5. You spoke about, I have 2 questions. You spoke about the process to get the new THA, the amendments to the THA Act proclaimed. In your estimation, do you think that...
Wait a minute. The process to get the Act proclaimed is very simple. It's done. It was done today. That's the process to get the Act proclaimed. It is simple, a cabinet decision which was done today. That will go to the president, and the Act will be proclaimed on Monday. So well, that's a simple process.
No, I'm talking about the steps through the parliament and so forth.
Oh, that's another step.
Yes. Given that you...
After the proclamation.
Yes. Given that you laid that out, in your estimation, your prediction, do you think that you can realistically see a THA elections taking place before 2022?
Of course. That's why the law spells out time there. Once it goes, the only unknown part of this equation is how long the EBC will take to do the report. And the EBC has 90 days, right, to do the report. So if the EBC takes the whole 90 days, we are now in mid-July, so mid-September, the EBC, no, October, mid-October, the EBC must report if they take the full 90 days. And then when they report, if the Parliament then proceeds to debate it urgently, it will be done, and that's where it'll take us towards the end of the year, because the Parliament will have to decide when it debates that report. So if the Parliament drags its feet or doesn't bring it up for debate, that will extend the time. But based on what, as head of the government, what I've been saying all along, you are right to expect that we'll do it with dispatch. So if the EBC takes 60 days, then it shortens it. If it takes 30 days, then it shortens it. If it takes 2 weeks, so it all depends on how quickly the EBC can do that report. And I did mention that the EBC, as we know, is positioned on Tobago to do this with expedition because the EBC has just worked on Tobago's voters list last January. So it's just a question of redoing that list on the work that they had done for the January election. But that is entirely up to the EBC. The government has no say in that. No, not even the Parliament, because the EBC will take the instructions from the Parliament as per the number of seats. But in the actual work on the ground, in the constituency, on their database and so on, that is entirely up to the EBC. And, you know, we are well positioned now for that to be done quickly.
Concerning my second question, you spoke about the government's plan to accelerate the vaccination program, and you just spoke about extreme measures being taken if it should get to that. But before that...
No, not extreme measures. I don't want to be quoted as that. Being vaccinated is not an extreme measure. I'm sure you were vaccinated many times. And as George said, frequently we get vaccinated. The last time I was vaccinated, it was not because I wanted to be vaccinated. I was going to a country that required me to get hepatitis vaccination. And I've been to countries before in work where I had to be vaccinated for coming from Trinidad and Tobago. We have to have a yellow fever vaccine, otherwise they don't enter some European countries. So it's not an extreme measure. As a matter of fact, it's a normal measure. One of the problems, one of the reasons for hesitancy, which is most common in my experience in talking to people in this period, is the saying that the vaccine They don't mind being vaccinated. They don't mind a vaccine. But this vaccine was developed too quickly. Now, the same way that the new technology of Facebook and the friends causing problems in misleading people and spreading conspiracy theories and frightening people, the same way that has come so quickly as a communication system for people, where now in the southern United States, they are saying that Facebook is drowning out the science of vaccination, resulting in the population not using vaccines to protect their lives. It's that same kind of speedy technology, available technology, that allowed these vaccines to be developed so quickly. Because they didn't start from scratch. Many of those laboratories that got approval for the vaccines they prepared would tell you that they were in fact working on the coronavirus for the longest while, because that's where the normal flu exists. So there was work going on. So as soon as the gene sequencing was done, those labs were able to very quickly develop a vaccine, and then they went through the trials, and then we ended up with what was chosen and what was not. So it's not that they just picked up something quickly and handed it to you. And we as a country rely on the technical support and expertise of the WHO team, which have for the world the technical backing to allow you to safely say, well, a WHO stamp is a good stamp on a product of this nature.
I really wanted to get to, apart from convincing and urging persons to encouraging persons to take the vaccine, is the government looking at any other strategies towards getting persons to take the jab?
Well, we make, first and foremost, our strategy is to make it available across the entire country, and then we'll continue to encourage people in more ways than one to take it. You know, some people require encouragement, and we will encourage as far as we're able to.
Camille McKechnie, Guardian Media. Mr. PM, I just wanted to ask you whether or not you're satisfied with the way in which the pandemic is being handled in Tobago. And secondly, whether or not you were any closer to making vaccination mandatory.
First question. As leader of the government, I rely on the rest of the government and the government support system to determine what is happening in Tobago and whether I should be satisfied. Last week, when there was a report that there were issues of increased frequency of confirmations in the hospital, I detailed the minister with the CMO to send a team to Tobago immediately to ensure that the staff in Tobago is following all that needs to be followed, is doing all that needs to be done to ensure that Tobago's response to the virus is equal to or better than that in Trinidad. That team came here and they were mandated to report back to me immediately. They did so, and in short, to answer your question, yes, I'm satisfied that the Tobago Health Team, under the guidance and with the cooperation of the National Health Team, is doing for Tobago what the population in Tobago can expect from the National Health Service. And the other one about mandatory, I want to repeat that the Cabinet at this time has not discussed making vaccines mandatory in Trinidad and Tobago, and that is for the reasons I gave earlier on.
Kenisha George Harry, Newsday. Mr. Prime Minister, back to the 6-6 deadlock. The resolution in the Parliament that accepts the EBC reports, does it require a simple majority or?
Simple majority.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Oh, okay. Yes, sir. Assemblyman Clarence Jacob said yesterday that the government should have more conversation.
More?
should have more conversation with the people in Crown Point who are displaced by the expansion, the airport expansion project. He said it on Rise and Shine. He said it in relation to Block D. There are 40 people at Block D who are occupying Block D now, and they have not been compensated as yet. What actually happened is that the water supply was cut. And after they got on social media, the water supply was actually reconnected. So do you agree with his statement that the government should have more conversation and more care, he said, that's quoting him, with persons affected by the Crown Point expansion project?
Well, I wouldn't want to respond to that without knowing the facts. What I do know is that the central government has taken all steps to put in place all reasonable approaches to ensure that the site that is required for Tobago's infrastructure development at that location is carried out. We started out with hiring a professional group of people whose expertise is in negotiation. They came to Tobago working for the government, did that, and of course I also know that the THA has done a significant amount of work to ensure that the persons who are affected are treated in the most humane and comfortable way. There's relocation available, land is prepared, and so on. But I also know that there are people who have issues around their relocation. Some of those issues may or may not have a basis. But since I do not have the individual facts, I would not want to speculate. But I can tell you overall that this has not been a matter that was treated lightly or without concern. And in fact, it has been quite an expensive arrangement because I see the bills. It's a huge amount of money that's been paid to people, so nobody is being driven out with their hands empty. And it's the value of the property. There's a basis and there's a law that's involved. And between the central government and the THA, to the best of my knowledge, those requirements are met. But sometimes you might be the best will in the world, you are unable to please everybody in a situation. But overall, the government has put in place reasonable arrangements.
Okay, as head of the National Security Council, there's a photograph now circulating of a helicopter being transported in Trinidad, allegedly over the weekend. So the opposition is now calling on you to find out whether or not that helicopter, S-76D, the leased helicopter, was scrapped.
Well, since you raised it, I will just tell you that the opposition would do well to keep quiet on that matter, because that's one of the albatrosses that we found around our neck. Somebody in the last government made an arrangement with that helicopter that cost millions of dollars for a helicopter which largely could not be utilized. And the contract was such that the government was so tied up, the proverbial market crab would be a laughing stock as compared to that. When we came into office and saw the arrangement in place, the government of Trinidad and Tobago could not continue those arrangements for an item which was largely unusable. And I think since you are raising it, and I guess it will be raised by the opposition, that when we get to the parliament, I give you the assurance when we get to the parliament in September, that the relevant minister will make a statement in the parliament on that matter.
Mr. Prime Minister, Liz Williams again, TV6 News. In terms of the grants, the distribution of COVID relief grants, are you disappointed with the slow pace in terms of the rollout for payments? Because I know a number of people, they have been home since May. That's just one of my first questions. And my second question is, what is the future of Atlantic LNG given the concerns about the future of Train 1 and the fact that the natural gas supply contracts for Trains 2, 3, and 4 are due to be renegotiated before 2025?
The first question dealing with what was the first question?
COVID relief grants.
COVID. Yeah, this granting of money to people is always going to be a difficult process. I would wish that it had been faster, but because one has to screen the situation, there's an inbuilt delay that is involved, and I must tell you that we have had some significant problems in ensuring that persons who are accessing those grants are in fact entitled to them. And that has slowed down the process. And I wouldn't go into more detail than that. And there might be other issues that would have caused the slowing of it, but it really is something that when we authorize a category of persons, we would like them to get the grant faster than they have been getting it, but sometimes there are explainable delays. The other day I answered a question in the parliament when somebody asked me whether the people will get their grant before the end of the year. And I said, yes, they would. And then, unfortunately, the news in reporting that out of context said the Prime Minister said that they will get their grant before the end of the year. That was never what I meant. And I went on to say that people who applied earlier in the program would get their grants before those who applied later. And the ones who we approved later were the construction workers. So I could see some element of time, but it doesn't have to be inordinately long. But I do know that the ministry is having some difficulty, and you yourself would have seen some of the difficulties that we have had there. And even in the face of your question, you would have seen in the newspaper long list of names of people for whom checks are lying in the ministry without those persons collecting them. And when you see that, it tells you one of two things. So we are paying attention to that. But overall, my approach to dealing with this is to try and put something in place that in the event that we ever have to do this again or anything similar, that the difficulties that are really hamstringing us now will not be there. And that is, we have created a Ministry of Digital Transformation where every person in this country would become a uniquely identified person in the e-identity program, which means that you will be more easily identified in the public system, and therefore it will be easier to treat with you for any matter that you are interacting with the government on. So hopefully when that becomes reality, what's happening now would be a thing of the past. And the next question was? Oh, Atlantic LNG and Train 1, Train 2. Let me just say this. Trinidad and Tobago, as a gas producer, is in the competitive world of selling natural gas to the plant and the plant selling to the world. And therefore, contracts involved here are huge in terms of value of money, but the confidentiality of the negotiations are important assets. One cannot conduct these negotiations, such sensitive and far-reaching negotiations. You cannot conduct it on the front page of the newspaper. Otherwise, you would disadvantage the population of Trinidad and Tobago. Suffice it to say that these negotiations are going on where they have to go on, have gone on where they were supposed to, and currently, particularly with respect to Train 1 and Trains 2, in Train 1 in particular, we are engaged currently in sensitive negotiations with all the shareholders. So I am not prepared to say anything more than that. At the appropriate time, when there's something that we could say that doesn't jeopardize our interests, rest assured that you will be told. Because we in this country have an open arrangements, and the government has nothing to hide. As a matter of fact, we have a lot to be proud of. And we'll be pleased to announce to you that we've done the best for the country, even if the circumstances are difficult.
Prime Minister George Leacock, with it, again.
Yes, George.
In this interim period, there was an announcement that the Minister of Finance would work with somebody to come up with a budget for the Tobago House of Assembly. Because as soon as this process is finished and we have 5 spanking new assembly persons to go with the 15 we have, 15 now, from 12 to 15, so we have to at least have 3 more office spaces and all of that. How is this budget going to be prepared? And I have another question.
Well, the Ministry of Finance has a budget division where there are people who specialize in budgeting, and they would not be strangers to the budgeting process. So most of the obvious would be taken care of in the budgeting program. So if the budget was taken care of 12 and now it's going to be 15, it would be relatively simple to add that to the budget. And even if it is not added, it can always be replenished, because the Minister of Finance has the authority to get approvals to spend monies that were not appropriated in the budget. So the budget is not really a concrete wall that once it hardens, you can't move it. The budgeting process is really one of estimates. And the Minister of Finance has a lot of flexibility in treating with estimates.
Possibility that when we do have a new Secretary for Finance, there could be a review.
Well, the Minister of Finance will take that on board. If you do have a Secretary for Finance, as I expect you will, and what has been passed by the Parliament would have been based on historical things, and if there are new arrangements, as I expect there might be, but dealing with Act number 40 of 96, I don't expect the changes to be fundamental. If it was the Joint Select Committee arrangement, it would have been far more intrusive in the budgetary process. But that is not what it's going to be. It's going to be a change in number of people, and that number of elected people, and that shouldn't really cause too much of a budgetary stress.
And Prime Minister, finally for me, I promise you I'm not going to come to any of these press conferences and not ask you about recovery. How is the recovery team? What's the plans? What do we have in our arsenal? What are the early low-hanging fruit that we can go at in terms of getting ourselves back on some kind of growth path?
Okay, that's good of you, because what we are aiming to do before we start literally drilling down into recovery is making sure that we are in a good position in coping with the pandemic, which is still raging. You would have seen a cabinet, some minor adjustment in the cabinet recently, and that is in the context of the recovery. The Minister of Public Administration is in fact the chairman of the recovery process, and very soon when we come out with the Parliament in September, we will begin to speak specifically about recovery as you raised it. Where do we go from here? Expecting that behind us will be a vaccinated population, and that we're coping with whatever the virus is throwing at us. And we'll be focusing now on, one, reporting on how we have managed to cope, because there were some significant actions we had to take, and what are the changes we can be making, and what our expectations are. So the budget of 2021 going forward would be a budget that will have to take all of these things into account. I've been in the budgeting process now for many, many years, and I can't recall ever going through this period as we're going through here now, as you're preparing, because now, you know, before the budget date, you have the call from the ministries where everybody wants this, everybody wants that, everybody wants the other, and they normally just throw millions at you, and then the Minister of Finance will just extract what is affordable in that. Well, over and above that, we still are going to have the COVID effects, and we have bills to pay from the last time, and then we have to find funding going forward. So it's a very complicated period, but there will be some interesting parts of the coming budget, and we as a population, hopefully all of us will be alive. Going forward, we have to inhale deeply and then step out confidently in doing things that are required to be done in the future, into what we would want to believe is a post-pandemic period.
Mr. Prime Minister, Liz Williams again, TV6 News, and I promise you this will be my last set of questions.
Good, so that was George's last question. This is your last question.
Set of questions.
We coming to the end.
Okay. In terms of the same question that George just asked, but specifically to Tobago, what are you looking at in terms of Tobago's recovery in terms of tourism? Anything specifically that you're looking at?
One is that Tobago is a population that will be relatively healthy, and not only for the local interest, but healthy to the outside world, because Tobago's economy relies very heavily on inflows from the outside world. And we want to have the population in Tobago being open to tourism from the outside as well as from Trinidad in particular. I expect part of the recovery, George, you would see Caribbean Airlines flying into Tobago from a metropolitan area, at least one. And that should give Tobago a bit of a boost. In the new arrangements for Caribbean Airlines, we will want, we're asking for, well, probably 2 flights, maybe 3, I don't know what Carlo will be able to afford, but to link Tobago to the metropolitan area, that is going to be one change. Government has funded that airline considerably, and it is my position that, and the government's position, that if we are doing that for an airline, then Tobago ought to have a claim on the service of that airline, airport to airport. And then, of course, I would expect that there will be a new assembly in place sometime towards the end of the year, and whoever is in the assembly will focus on encouraging the private sector to get back on its feet, because the Ministry of Finance from central government and the rest of the population will be encouraging Tobago to stand strong and get back to being what Tobago was heading to be before we were disturbed by COVID. You no longer have a ferry problem, which you had early on in the term of this government. You have 2 of the best ferries in the world now running between Trinidad and Tobago, and we expect that when they are fully operational without COVID restrictions, that Tobago would be seeing the effect, the economic effect of that. And of course, I was really hoping that if we did get the Joint Select Committee report brought into law in Tobago, that land management and land utilization would have exploded in Tobago, because the arrangements in there for the Tobago Island government to be in control of land management would put Tobagonians in a position to be able to get the benefits of their lands without losing their interest in those lands. And we do have at the level of the Ministry of Trade that runs ETEC, that owns Rocky Point. We are in a process there now where we went out for an expression of interest. We did get expressions of interest. The Cabinet has put in place an evaluation committee to evaluate those interests, and we are now moving to the next phase of the interested, whoever is selected there, to put a proposal for the use of Rocky Point for the building of yet another hotel in Tobago, and that would be much to Tobago's benefit. So these are the kind of things that you'll be seeing, and of course the possibly cliched term of Tobago needs to get into agriculture. And we are seeing signs among some Tobago young people and in some areas of Tobago that agriculture is beginning to stir people's interests. I'm particularly pleased with what I saw in the Goldsboro area, and there are some other areas that can very quickly be contributing significantly to Tobago's fresh food supply and also the Trinidad market. So you will see things like these taking place.
I know you said before that there's going to be phased reopening. You're looking at the figures. The figures are much more down now than before. Persons are asking about retail stores, furniture stores, maternity stores. Any announcements?
That's the next big group. The next big group that is on the horizon is the retail supplies, those like the malls and the retail stores. We are prepared to look at that, and that's why the vaccination of those people involved in those trades, you will see that's one cohort of the population that's being encouraged to get vaccinated, as we did with the others. We did supermarket association, construction workers, teachers. I'm very disappointed today to hear that the arrangements made for teachers were not taken up. That has me very concerned, because I'm really hoping that the teachers will get vaccinated so that by the time we get around to school in September, we wouldn't have the issue of vaccination and teachers and children in September. So I hope that that is just a temporary setback there, and we would like to have as many of our teachers vaccinated as we go forward. But that group is the largest group that is still outside.
And in terms of public servants, back to 100% in terms of work?
At the first opportunity we will, but the government has been taking that responsibility of reducing the public servant exposure as the national effort required that reduction to take place. But public servants should be back to work once the population is sufficiently vaccinated.
And my final question, I know some persons are asking parliamentarians, why didn't parliamentarians during this COVID-19 period also take the burden of a salary cut? I don't know if that came up at all in cabinet during your discussions.
No, it did not come up, because parliamentarians do what they can and what they do on their own with respect to spending their personal money in and around their constituencies. And I know that for a fact because I myself do that. Many parliamentarians, not all, but many parliamentarians do put their hands in their pocket in their constituency in a significant way. So the symbolism would be great, but I guess we're more concerned about what actually happens as against symbolism.
Camille McKechnie, Guardian Media. We've seen a report where the president has asked unvaccinated security officers to stay away. Have you taken a similar position?
Well, I don't know that the president has asked them to stay away. I know that I've seen, I'm not officially, I've seen the papers and I take it as read, that the president has indicated that in the same way that there are people making their choice about being or not being vaccinated, I think the president would have made the choice of wanting to preserve her life and the life of her mother, 92-year-old. I too have taken a similar position because I am in the group of people who are particularly exposed to the virus, so I will do everything possible to reduce or minimize my exposure to being infected. I did that. Unfortunately, I was infected. So I followed the protocols, and I still do so. And one of the protocols that I have to follow is to not unnecessarily, unknowingly expose myself to infections. So it's the best you can do. I don't think you can do anything else, because each person has his or her right to take action in preservation of his or her life.
I just wanted to ask again, we know that the whole 6-6 situation is unprecedented in Tobago. We know that there would have been a budget. We, the members of the population...
I thought that was the last question.
Last question. We know that the population would have been aware of the spending within the THA, because you actually say the finance secretary would say how he spent the THA's money over the year or so. We have heard instances of lands being bought, people being hired at exorbitant prices, and there have been many accusations about quote-unquote runaway spending with this.
Listen,
are you going to advise Mr. PM?
Much of that is political old talk. If I were you, I'd sleep well, believing that is not true. Because, you know, I've heard a lot of it, and as a matter of fact, I heard about one particular land purchase, and I immediately got on the phone and asked, what is going on here? Only to be told, it's not true. And you see, it might disturb you, but that is the intention. Those who generate that kind of story about exorbitant this and whatever, a lot of it is not true. The assembly is basically existing now in a holding pattern, and you know, I have had instances to ask a question here and there. I have an officer in Tobago, in case you forgot that, so I am pretty much up to date with what's going on in Tobago, and I make it my business to ask questions when I see those things, and you'd be amazed at how bold-faced some of the lies are. Well, unless Liz has one more question, thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you weren't inconvenienced by being here, but it was so much more convenient to talk to you from here today. Thank you very much.